Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. If you're a regular on our webinars, welcome back again. And if you're new to us, I hope that you will enjoy your first time with us this evening. For our topic, reviewing carbohydrate counting. Kind of all the information about what it is and, most importantly, how to do it and how to use it, clinically for different things with your clients. So with that, let's just start right in and let's go through the slides. So I guess the first question that comes up is, why would anybody think about doing carb counting? And the primary reason is that research has now shown, and we know that one of the major contributors to inflammation and chronic disease risk in people is an after-meal spike in glucose levels, and the situation where the blood is overloaded with glucose and fat and nutrients and cannot adequately handle those nutrients. So this postprandial dysglycemia is the after-meal response of the body where the blood is blooded with the nutrients and where it is especially loaded with glucose, and therefore insulin levels spike, and that is a response in the body that has quite an inflammatory effect. So the primary reason to control carbohydrates is to address this issue of postprandial dysglycemia. And so a way we can do that and bring awareness to our clients on this issue is to introduce them to this idea of reducing their carbohydrate intake by a certain amount. And a method for doing that is something called carbohydrate counting. So there have been studies done on ways to effectively do this where we reduce this post-meal dysglycemic effect. And there were several important factors that were identified with your way of eating that were found to be helpful. And of course, one of the central to it is point number 1 here on this first bullet point, is that people need to change the types of carbohydrates that they're eating and probably the amounts, although in a lot of the anti-inflammatory diets, the way that the amount is addressed is to simply say limit our portion sizes. So we change the quality of the carbs. Instead of high glycemic carbs, which are refined white flours, white rice, potato, switch it out to lower glycemic index sources of carbohydrate. And of course the lowest source of carbohydrate and glycemic index and a small amount of carb and a low amount of calories are non-starchy vegetables. Fruits are fairly low in glycemic index, and compared to refined sugars, they're way lower. And of course, they're a source of fiber and more nutrient dense, so they're considered an appropriate choice. Whole grains, legumes, and nuts. The other thing that can help counteract this tendency for the blood sugar to really spike after a meal is to kind of do what I call grounding a meal by consuming lean protein sources with the meal. And this particular study, and you'll have the study citation on the next slide, says at all your major 3 meals, consume a portion of lean protein. And that really helps hold down the glycemic response of that meal, each meal that you do these measures with. The other thing is to eat a handful of nuts a day. Believe it or not, when we eat nuts daily, this helps reduce post-meal dysglycemia. Not really known all the reasons why, possibly due to the rich trace mineral content, but just when they studied dietary habits of people after meals, when you ate a handful of nuts, with your meal, it helped keep down the glycemic response. Interestingly, eating a salad every day as well, and they specifically say consisting of leafy greens with a dressing of vinegar, because vinegar itself was found to hold down the after meal glycemic response. So key here is avoiding highly processed foods and beverages, especially those with sugar, high fructose corn syrup, white flour, and also eliminate trans fats. And then, of course, as I said, to address the quantity issue, it was simply the recommendation to limit portion sizes. So this way of eating is what we call an anti-inflammatory diet. And then other recommendations out of this study from 2008 were that people should try to maintain their weight and avoid becoming overweight and obesity, which these types of recommendations always, astound me because, if it were so easy, people would already be there. And gaining weight is one of the things that in and of itself causes insulin resistance and jacks up that post-meal glycemic response. But, people, it's not an easy thing to do. So just saying control your weight isn't necessarily that helpful for people, but oh well, this was included in the recommendations of the study. Try to control your weight, perform physical activity. And one other thing, believe it or not, consuming an alcoholic beverage with the meal, believe it or not, is a factor that holds down glycemic response. So a glass of wine with the meal is not such a bad idea from a glycemic standpoint, but of course with alcohol there come other challenges. We have to make sure people are not prone to alcoholism, that type of thing. So that's why they say, if no history of alcoholism, then an evening meal alcoholic beverages is okay when it comes to glycemic response anyway. So that's anti-inflammatory diet recommendations. Let's move on here to the next slide. There are several diets that have become sort of popular diets, especially Mediterranean diet, that kind of can be lumped into diets that would fit this anti-inflammatory diet category, like Mediterranean diet, DASH diet. Harvard has their healthy eating pyramid, which is built specifically to be an anti-inflammatory diet. And actually, if somebody wants to, just to start to improve the overall quality of their diet, if they've been kind of a junk food eater, they never really have learned how to eat healthily, I kind of like these simple recommendations as a starting point. However, the big con, as I put it on the slide, to these diets is that they are very general. This general idea of portion control generally isn't good enough as a strategy for people for losing weight. They just don't really know how much to cut down portions. So a lot of times that just doesn't work. So one of the factors that this whole idea of controlling carbohydrates involves is this concept of the types of carbohydrates that we eat and how much they cause our blood sugar to spike after we eat. And so this whole glycemic index and glycemic load thing comes into it. There for a while people were doing things like trying to limit the high glycemic index foods specifically. And so people found out, okay, banana's fairly high as a fruit, so I'm not going to eat banana, that type of thing. However, that typically doesn't work long term. So it's much better to think in terms of total glycemic load. For example, one of the things that I found happen with glycemic index is that people will only eat berries because it's the lowest glycemic index fruit. And so that's all they eat are berries, berries, berries. And honestly, and I'm not exaggerating, I've seen this many, many times. Over the years, I've had people that when they employed that approach, what happened was they became allergic to berries. And I've seen it happen many times. I had a male client that I remember when we were open at LaValle Metabolic Institute in Ohio that became allergic to blueberries. I know another sort of a diet guru, luminary person that was out there, promoting healthy diets that became allergic to raspberries. So it can happen, let's move to the next slide. So it's just something to think about. We like to see a lot of variety in the diet, but there is a strong presence of, evidence in the literature that shows that, when people eat high glycemic load, that their health risks do increase, and that high glycemic index foods, high intake of them is correlated with elevated hemoglobin A1C. So I'm not saying it's not a good thing to be considering. In fact, it is considered, and that's why we're going over all this by way of review again on the carbohydrate counting topic tonight. So with the next slide, just a little bit more on the glycemic impact of food. So basically, a lot of times with our clients, we really have to back up, and we have to, in fact, you could use this slide as your sort of, your way of speaking with clients about the glycemic impact of foods, and we have to explain that we're looking to control the foods that cause us to produce insulin. So high glycemic index foods are our sugary foods, fruits and fruit juices, which has now become another big issue today. I mean, most people kind of knew don't drink a big glass of juice, but what are people doing now but going to juice it up type bars and getting these huge glasses of juice, which are loaded with fruit juices and other sugars many times, or they're getting these acai bowls and they're just loaded with grams and grams and grams of simple sugars. The other sources are starchy foods. So a lot of people get starch confused. So, we have to remind them what a starch is. Anything that's, if you think of cornstarch, there are foods that contain that molecule, and there are things like potatoes, rice, breads, cereals, pastas, anything made from grains, refined or whole or otherwise, and potatoes. And interestingly, there's this one little vegetable called a carrot that actually has kind of a high glycemic index, but where it's different from these other sources of carbohydrates, a carrot contains only limited grams of carbohydrates. So even though it might spike the blood sugar up relatively quickly, it doesn't make a prolonged spike in blood sugar because the total amount of carbohydrate in the carrot is not that high compared to those other foods. Now, foods with a high glycemic load are the foods that contain many grams of carbohydrate, period. So per unit. So let's say on a whole grain or a starchy food, you're going to get 15 grams of carbohydrate in about a half a cup. Same with fruit. With some real concentrated fruits that are dried, like dates or raisins, it could be much less than that, maybe only an ounce or so, a tablespoon of the fruit, that you'll get 15 grams of carbohydrate. So the foods that do not spike our blood sugar are animal proteins, non-starchy vegetables, so those are your things like broccoli, cauliflower, celery, etc., and our fats. Next slide. So again, how high and how quickly blood sugar, so people understand which foods we're talking about. But believe it or not, people like it when I tell them. A lot of times people have heard, well, I've heard I shouldn't eat carrots. And I say, no, there's only about 5 grams of carbohydrate in a half a cup of carrots. So it's in a different category. Even though it might make your blood sugar spike a little bit from the carb that is in there, the total amount of the carbohydrate in the food is not that high. So the foods you want to limit are the things like potatoes, rice, the grains. Even oatmeal is high glycemic load because it's very starchy. So as you can see there, 15 grams of carb in a very small measurement of the food. So when we look at overall approach to dieting, as you know, a very popular approach out there is to just do calorie control, a low-fat calorie control diet, something like Weight Watchers, which most of those are set at the intake being about 50 to 60% of the calories coming from carbohydrates. And the good news is that most of these types of diets are now offering a lower glycemic option, you know, lower glycemic index foods, higher fiber options. However, the high glycemic index foods, even if quantity controlled, because a lot of times what you'll see in these diets is you'll see, well, they have a little dessert that they'll offer, and maybe they throw in some fiber, but even though it's better than the other option, it's still a high glycemic index food, even though the portion is small and it's calorie controlled and all that. It can be enough to stimulate appetite. And in fact, that's one of the drawbacks of that way of eating, is that, you know, people don't want to give up desserts, but sometimes even the small little portion of it, all it does is it stimulates appetite and makes you want to eat more, and then it makes it hard to stick with, you know, maintaining that lower calorie intake. So the low glycemic index and low glycemic load foods are much more satiating, and it has to do with the rise and fall of blood sugar after eating those higher glycemic foods. So it's a way to help control appetite by, in whatever diet we choose, employing this lower carb, you know, carb control portion or part of it into the plan. So, you know, what the government has evolved to is this My Plate method. And, you know, I'm actually not like, I think it's a step in the right direction to show people, and in fact, I have a My Plate in my office, that my particular plate, the left side of the plate is full of all vegetables and not split with fruits. I make the grain portion a little smaller, and I make the protein portion a little bigger. And then, of course, dairy, where that comes in is if you're considering individual intolerances to milk products, which can come in the form of lactose intolerance, or which can come in the form of immune allergies or other immune reactivities to that food, because it's a highly allergenic food. But, you know, I can work with the plate itself, and then we have to use the dairy part, which I don't have there in my office, but that's a discussion talking about immune reactivity to foods and how that can also be a factor. And, of course, the general information that's out there in conventional medical information really doesn't, most of it doesn't venture into talking about immune reactivity and what all it can do in our bodies. And as you know, if you're familiar with metabolic code diet, that's the other big half of diet that we consider. But tonight I just want to explain this carb control portion for a reason, and you'll find out as we move through the slides. So just to give you a picture of what a diet looks like when we compare a calorie-controlled approach versus a carb-controlled approach. So if you look at that first line, 1,500 calories, if we calculate that out in the middle of that 50 to 60% general carb amount that is typically used, that'll come out to about 206 grams of carbohydrate per day. Now, let's assume that the person is going to eat healthy, and they're going to have a lot of vegetable servings, and they're going to limit their fruits, because we know that, you know, they're a little bit much more high glycemic than non-starchy vegetables, but they're still a healthy food. That will give you about 60 grams of carb. So with that 146 grams remaining, if you split that between your starchy foods and those higher glycemic index and load foods like some sweets, but we're going to control the amount, that means they would have about 10 servings of that type of food per day. On the other hand, if you look at a carb-controlled, it'll be much lower, and we'll see on the next slide. Also, when you do calorie-controlled, at 55% carb, typically the protein intake is 20%, so that would mean about 75 grams of protein per day on this 1,500 calorie diet. Next slide. So if we look at a 1,500 calorie diet at a 20% carb level, which would be in the low carb diet category, a low carb diet can be anything from 10% clear up to 40%. So there's this wide range of carbohydrate intake. When people just sort of lump low carb diet, that's where that falls. So different versions of low carb diet out there have different percentages of carbohydrate intake. 20% is fairly low. So let's look at this and say 75 grams of carb, and we're going to eat those non-starchy vegetables, which average 5 grams of carb per serving, and a serving is 1/2 cup cooked or 1 cup raw. And let's say they're going to have a few of those starches and fruits, which are 15 grams per serving, and the serving size varies widely, and I'm going to go over this more later. But if they're consuming the recommended 10 vegetables per day, so let's say we're going a little bit higher even, then this would leave 1 to 2 starches and 1 to 2 fruits. Since we've ratcheted down the carb, we go up on the protein and fat. 25% carb or protein level is, you know, actually pretty high. Just the way it breaks down with your actual diet, and if you get up to 30%, that's a little bit hard to accomplish unless the person uses protein powders. But regardless, with that range, they're going to be taking in 105 grams of protein. When you get 20 grams of protein from your other foods, that leaves about 85 grams of animal protein per day. That's 12 ounces split up between the 3 meals per day. So that would follow that anti-inflammatory diet recommendation perfectly. If we have a serving of lean protein at each major meal, say 3 ounces at breakfast, 4 ounces at lunch, and 5 at dinner, something like that, or you could split it up evenly. Okay, moving on. So this is a study that showed when people reduced the intake of high glycemic index and high glycemic load foods, that everyone and every group lost weight and waist circumference, but because they were calorie controlled. But the high carb groups, they split those up. One had lower glycemic index. The one that had the lowest nearly doubled the fat loss. So why I like to include this point is because I like people to understand that they can get to the weight that they need and want to lose by taking this approach to the diet. You can get to the fat loss. We don't want to lose muscle. We don't want to lose lean mass. And that's something I reviewed in my other webinars, is that, you know, they've really got to understand that, you know, your approach that you take to diet, it's not all just about the weight loss. You want to lose fat. And more people are aware of this as an issue, but this is the way to do it, is to look at your intake of high glycemic index and high glycemic load foods, and by reducing that, that's what will help you get to losing the fat and not just losing lean mass and hopefully some fat with it. So this is another diet study that I like to review when I'm kind of giving, you know, we're trying to show people there's an evidence base that's out there for this approach to weight loss and to health, you know, to maintaining health. So, you know, it's not just some fad thing that's been studied, and, you know, this is what we know from studies. So an American Heart Association diet is the diet that's outlined in that first bullet point. So this is a low-fat, calorie-controlled diet. They're usually no more than 30% fat. And when they followed this diet on this study for 2 years, in two years' time, they only lost 3.3 kilograms, which of course double that, you know, maybe about 7 pounds they lost. On a Mediterranean diet, which is a little bit higher fat, and the thing is they emphasize using olive oil, so it's a healthier fat. This was also calorie controlled. They lost more weight, 4.6 kilograms. And of all the diets, that diet had the highest intake of fiber. So they point that out, I guess, because on that diet with a little bit higher fat and maybe a little bit lower carb, there was more favorable glucose and insulin response than in the low-fat diet, especially in diabetics. So and the cholesterol to HDL ratio was reduced more on that. Then we look at the low-carb diet. And this was not a, oh, let's go back. I need to do that last point on there. The low-carb diet was not calorie controlled. It was simply carb controlled. And what they followed was an Atkins type approach where it was the 20 grams of carb induction, and they were instructed to follow the way the diet, that approach, recommends, is to eventually go up and not exceed 120 grams. And that group lost the most weight and had the greatest drop in triglycerides and the best improvement in the cholesterol to HDL. So that ratio, which means their cholesterol dropped the most and their HDL stayed higher, that was down 20%. So it was a good outcome with the greater carb control. Okay, now the other important thing that I like people to understand about a low-carb diet approach is that it protects the person's lean mass, and therefore their resting energy expenditure is protected. So this is just a study that showed when we did a low-fat approach to dieting or low glycemic load, there were, again, much better improvements in the blood glucose, triglyceride, all those markers. And the big point here is the resting energy expenditure reduced less in that low glycemic load group, and that group also had less hunger. Now, tell me where the downfall to this diet is here. I don't see one. We're protecting lean mass, so therefore we're protecting metabolic rate. We're protecting, we're helping reduce hunger. I mean, to me, and you'll see if you've ever seen me lecture live, the diets that I go for are the diets that people can stick to, and the way to stick to something is to, take measures that help it so that the person is not as hungry. We really can impact hunger by some of these measures. Okay, next slide. This is another one. I've reviewed some of these studies in my other slides, so I don't want to take a lot of time on it. But again, it's showing a low carb, higher protein compared to high fat and high carb with more fiber, because they're saying, okay, let's not necessarily think we have to reduce our carbohydrate intake, but let's just take in more fiber to try to be protective. So the next slide shows the results of this study. And again, I don't want to take a lot of time on them, but let's go down to the author's conclusion. You can look at this data a little more later if you want. So there were some ups and downs and some things that were best, but interestingly, the highest fat intake had the most loss in waist circumference. But when these authors looked at overall results, they felt that the higher protein, what they tagged as a higher protein diet, was the best overall approach for all the markers. But again, much more weight lost on the two low carb ones compared to the higher carb. So the big revelation that we've had now is that we need to control the quality of the carbs, and we need to try to at least, control the amount of them that we take in, at least by modest portions. But the big revelation that's come out, and I have to say, thank you for this study. This is what we have seen in clinical practice for, years. That there is an individual response to carbohydrates. We're talking about them as if they do the same thing in everyone, and they don't. We've seen this for years. When we do a low-carb approach, some people have to really cut back on those high glycemic load foods before they lose weight. Others, can eat way more and still lose weight. And that is why in our approach with the metabolic code diet, we start out with a very low amount of the high glycemic load carbs, and we slowly allow people to start to reintroduce those starchy foods. And see what their response to the higher glycemic foods is. You know, if somebody cuts down, as it's laid out in our phase 1 diet, to no starch other than a controlled amount of beans or legumes per day, and there's a reason we have that in there, which I'll explain more on later, and they really drop the weight, then you know that, you know, their insulin sensitivity is coming back around. And if you add in a very small, modest portion then after a while of doing that of a high glycemic load starchy food, and the weight loss just practically stops, you know you've got a very insulin resistant person. So this study was brilliant. It was published in a journal called Cell just last year, toward the end of last year. It's an Israeli study, and it was very good. It looked at 800 people, and what they did was they had people eat and go through their normal daily routine except for one meal a day. So what they did was they said, we're going to give you foods for one meal per day, and they wanted that to be the first meal. The rest of the day, you go about, eat, drink, exercise, sleep, do everything like you normally do. And these people were put on a continuous glucose monitor. So what they did was they collected the data to see how their blood sugar spiked after meals, and they also looked to see, well, did blood sugar spikes seem to correlate with any other things like exercise, sleep? They even looked at gut flora. So what they found out was no shock to, I think, the study authors, and certainly no shock to us. We observed this clinically, as I said, anyway, that there were wide variations among the study subjects to the same glucose intake and the same type of glucose and the same mixed meal loads. Different people some people had much higher blood glucose response than others. Now these blood glucose levels were recorded in, you know, European numbers, and I wasn't able to convert them to get them over to numbers that we would know closer to ours. But the point here is to see one of the carb things that they had people eat at that morning meal was just plain old bread and butter. And the glycemic response to bread and butter ranged anywhere from 15 milligrams per deciliter in European measurement to 79. So look at that variance. It was huge. They used bread and butter, they used plain bread, and they used a high fructose meal as one of the things that they studied. And it was interesting. While there was a varied response to the bread and butter, plain bread, and the other, I forget what the fourth meal was, there were 4 different mixes of carb. The one meal that had almost the same response in everyone, although there were slight variances among individuals, was a high fructose meal. And what the response was with that was a big initial spike in blood sugar, and then a quick drop, and then it just kept getting really, really low, and until the next meal. So that was interesting. Doesn't mean that high fructose is healthy to eat, because even though it dropped quickly, we know the effects of fructose in the liver and on hunger and different issues with high fructose meals that are not healthy. So, but anyway, it was just that was kind of a universal response to fructose intake that was really consistent. There were other things that they found in the study, like that there were certain foods that definitely tended to be more consistent, that in almost everyone there was a higher postprandial glucose response, and that was things like potatoes and rice. So it was good. It was consistent with other findings in other studies. And foods that were, even though they're fairly high in carbs, that did not spike blood sugar as much. You know, people are always surprised that ice cream doesn't have as high a glycemic response as you would think. Well, why is it? Because even though it's full of sugar, it's full of full-fat cream, and fat lowers glycemic response to meals, so a high fat intake along with the meal can bring down the glycemic response in most people. That is not a universal response, though, they found. But, you know, so I always tell people, look, if you want to eat something that's ice cream-like, just go ahead and eat regular ice cream. Don't eat sorbet that has no fat, no protein, because that's the other thing that ice cream has. Just eat, you know, regular ice cream or something that's higher in fat. And, you know, just keep it to a modest portion. Beer had lower glycemic response, and also dark chocolate. So and those were other things that were, again, consistent with other studies, other findings. So what they were looking at, that PPGR, that stands for postprandial glucose response. So what were the factors that, when they looked at all the responses of these 800 people, that were things that tended to be correlated with higher glycemic response after meals? So all the markers of insulin resistance. Not surprised by this, right? Because this means insulin resistance means that our body isn't dealing well with glucose. You make insulin, but it just doesn't, you know, the cells are not responsive to the insulin anymore. They become resistant. So when people have a high hemoglobin A1C, when they have elevated BMI, when they have elevated blood pressure, when they have, actually, this was an interesting one, this ALT, which is a liver marker, that being high, which makes sense because, again, when people have insulin resistance, they're not dealing with their glucose well. What happens? They tend to develop fatty liver. And from fatty liver, you can develop liver damage. So these markers were positively correlated with, you know, the more they were, the higher they were, the higher the postprandial glucose response was. No surprise there. There were other things that affected it, the carb and fat content of the meal. So the higher the carb intake, the higher the postprandial glucose response. The higher the fat content, generally the lower it was negatively correlated. So fat mixed in would tend to bring down the glycemic response in most people, but not everybody. Now, there were some really interesting, let's go back. There were some really interesting findings on things to do with gut flora. I don't have time to go into all of them in this, but I want to go into them more in my next webinar because they were really, really interesting. But the amount of time someone sleeps was also affected the postprandial glucose response, and even sodium content, which I was very surprised by that. And I hope to have more information on that later. So what they did then was they looked at these people, they looked at their response to their test meals and their response to their other regular meals. And they said, okay, definitely there are people that have an elevated, you know, they get more elevation from glucose intake than other people. So they developed a personalized carbohydrate amount based on what they saw. They put them on the lower carbohydrate diet, and it led, based on those individual responses, and it, you know, brought them into a range where they had a controlled postprandial glucose response. So basically what they were saying is carbohydrate counting is the way to go, and that is actually what they used in that study, was carbohydrate counting. I'm proud to say we had been talking about carbohydrate counting long before that study came out, but it's nice to be validated. So what do you do to do carbohydrate counting? The way to do this is you really have to go through a typical daily food intake, what people normally eat. And I tell people, you know, be really honest and be really as close as accurate as possible on the amounts of the carbohydrates you're taking in, because the more you're eating now, you know, the less you'll still be able to eat a little bit more even with your reduced amount. If people tell me that they're only taking in, let's say, you don't know what 6 servings is yet, but we're going to go through that. They're only eating 6 high carb food servings a day, and I have to cut that down to only 2. That's harder to comply with. But just be honest, and just, you know, you can have the clients do this on their own, or you can kind of walk through it with them. You do it yourself, or if you have someone in your office, you could train to do this. Just we have a carbohydrate counting tool that's available on our site, and you can actually use that form as a way to do this with people, and I'll show you that in just a minute. But what you're doing is you're trying to quantify how many carbohydrate servings they're taking in currently. And these are from the high glycemic index and high glycemic load foods. We're not counting non-starchy vegetables. Those are the foods they can eat as much as they want. And what it is each serving of food that gives you 15 grams of carbohydrate is a 1 carb serving. So what we know from all the information on like the diabetes exchanges and things like that is that, for example, if you're looking at rice, 1/3 cup of rice, whether it's brown or white, provides 15 grams of carbohydrate. 1/2 cup of potatoes, 1/2 to 3/4 cup of beans and legumes, depending on the type of bean, 1/2 cup of pasta. Now, when we're looking at things like cereals, crackers, chips, cookies, you know, packaged foods of different types, you have to use the label to figure out what is 1 carb serving from that food. So the next slide shows us how to do that. So this is a cookie that I found in a coffee shop, and it was made with oats and brown rice syrup, cranberries, brown rice flour, all kinds of look like great healthy ingredients, right? Oats, look at all the fiber that it gives us and calcium. Seems like a great healthy food, right? Maybe it is, but it's a high glycemic load food, so it's got to be controlled on the intake if you want to limit this postprandial inflammatory response. So we look and we go, okay, serving size is 2 ounce. Well, what's that? I have no idea. But there are 2 servings per package. So in this package, there were 2 cookies, you know, a cookie-like thing. So the amount of carb is in 1 serving, and if we go down to the total carbohydrate line, you can see it's 34 grams of carb in 1 cookie. Now, if you want, you can subtract the dietary fiber off of that total carb amount to get the net carb. That's okay. You can do that. So the net carb for 1 cookie was 30 grams of carb. So if we take that and we know that 15 grams is 1 serving, we divide 30 by 15, and I show this on the next slide. Let's go ahead and flip over. And this is summarizing what I just was saying. We divide 30 by 15. That 1 cookie is 2 carb servings, and that's how you use the label. Now this might seem a little painstaking, but this is the awareness that people need, because they have no idea how many carbs they're really consuming in a day's time. They really get their eyes open with this process. Okay, next slide then. Now fruits. Fruits, even though they're healthy and everything, and they're somewhat lower in glycemic index than, you know, regular dessert, if you want to swap it out that way, they are higher glycemic index, and they're really variable on the serving size. So where we get this information, like the servings, is from the diabetes exchanges. Again, if you've ever seen a diabetes exchange booklet, they have a whole list of all the different types of fruit. And the reason the serving sizes are so variable is because the amount of sugar in different fruits is so variable. So we know grapes to be a pretty sweet fruit. When we eat a grape, it's sweet. The serving size on grapes is 17 small grapes or 8 large grapes, 1 small apple, 3/4 cup of blueberries or blackberries, 12 cherries, this is how specific it is, 1 kiwi, 1 1/4 cup strawberries or watermelons, so we know, right, strawberries, not quite as sweet of a fruit. Juices, a 1/2 cup or a 1/3 cup, depending on the type. Cranberry juice is a very sweet juice. The serving size to get 15 grams of carb from cranberry juice is a 1/3 cup. If you're looking at apple juice, it's a 1/2 cup. Grape juice is also a 1/3 cup. 1 small banana or 1/2 a large banana. Now there are all kinds of other foods that that are kind of out there, you know, like raisins are listed in the diabetes exchanges, and the serving size for raisins is 2 tablespoons, so it takes 2 tablespoons of raisins. So now on a glycemic index approach, people stopped eating raisins. And I don't like limiting the variety of our foods. For one, you know, all the different foods have a little different unique package of nutrients for us. And also, we need variety. So, you know, at least most people do. Some people are happy to kind of eat the same foods over and over again. But when you're eating salad every day, one day I like to have a spinach salad. And, you know, maybe I'll put a couple of strawberries on it. Typically, I eat my fruit separately. But, you know, people like that combination, maybe a few strawberries in a salad or a few raisins on a salad. I like raisins on salad sometimes. So 2 tablespoons on a serving of salad is plenty, you know, so it gives variety. I'm pointing out the goji berries because that's like a superfood today, right? Goji berries, everybody's into them, and actually they're a superfood that I really like, and I like them on salads a lot. They're higher fiber and protein than most fruits, but they're still not quite enough to take away from all the carb. But look at the serving size here, 1 ounce. Now, this is another point I was going to make. Most people have no clue what 1 ounce is, and it's going to be different for different foods. So I really strongly suggest to really get good at doing this carbohydrate counting and tracking of these high glycemic foods, get a food scale. They're easy to find in, you know, different cooking stores, or, you know, even in general, you know, places like Target. And you can actually just throw some on that scale and find out exactly how many is, you know, goji berries is 1 ounce. When I measured them out on my scale, it was a good, you know, like fill the cup of my, you know, when you cup your hand, filled that up pretty good. But 21 grams of carbohydrate, and if you subtract that 3 grams of fiber, then that's 18 grams net carb, divided by the 15 grams per serving, that's a little over 1 serving if you eat 1 ounce of goji berries. Okay, so this is the process. So what we have done, it's such an important thing for people to do and have an awareness of with their diet. We put together what we call a carbohydrate counting tool. And this is the introductory paragraph at the top of the page. And it just explains to people that, you know, the type of carbohydrates, we said quality, but it really means the type. An amount we eat is a key thing for helping us manage our weight and preventing these chronic diseases that are, you know, becoming epidemic, especially diabetes and heart disease. So we put together the tool to help people go through this process to say, okay, how many carbs are you taking in a day? So the next slide shows some of the list of foods that we put together to show people. Now, this is not a comprehensive list, but we tried to get most of the really common foods that people eat so that they could see. And we did it by categories like starchy vegetables and beans. So about a 1/2 cup of potato, sweet potato, peas, corns, grits, things like that. Now, we generalized on this, on the beans, to a 1/2 cup, just because we were trying to fit in as many foods as possible. But if you go to the trouble to look at a diabetes exchange list, you'll see, for example, that with lima beans, it takes 2/3 cup to get that same 15 grams of carb. But again, we just wanted to keep it general for people here. Also, people need to be aware that hummus is hummus and bean dips. That's about 1/3 cup. And then we have all the listings of the fruits. In general, 2 tablespoons of a dried fruit, just the things that I just went through with you earlier. And then the breads, grains, and cereal category. And generally, 1 slice of bread, depending on, you know, the size of the slice, the thickness of the slice. So you really kind of have to go by the labels on the breads. But in general, 1 slice will be somewhere around 15 grams of carb. Some pieces of bread are as low as maybe 12 grams, and then others might be up as high as 18 grams or more per slice. So you really have to look at the label. You also need to look at the nutrition information on things like English muffins and bagels and even small muffins. It's a very small amount of those that it takes to get the 15 grams of carb. So if people are eating a sandwich, a bun, you know, top and bottom would be about 15 grams of carb in 1/2 of that bun. Those are generally about 30 grams per bun, you know, for the whole thing. So anyway, we just put all the common foods on here. And then, of course, what really kills people is the last category, are the sweets and snack foods. You know, one of the things, and I can't remember if we put it on here or not. I think we ended up not putting it on here. But you have to watch these flavored coffee creamers, because people can really, you know, give a good old pour of it in their coffee, and before you know it, you can have a good 15 grams of sugar in there. So people need to watch those. So anyway, the next slide will show at the bottom of the carbohydrate counting tool, we have an area where, and we have instructions above this that tell people, go through your typical day, look at what you eat for breakfast. Do you have a piece of toast? Do you have 2? Do you have a bagel? What do you have? Look at the label, if there's a label to it, or, and most of them will, because even if you're eating oatmeal, you're getting it out of a package, and find out how much you eat, measure it, and then go, oh my gosh, okay, I eat oatmeal, but I eat about, you know, whatever, 1 1/3 cup. So I'm getting 45 grams of carbohydrate in that breakfast. Oh, I've got a tally, 3 slashes. I take in 3 carbs at breakfast. Oh, and then mid-morning, you know, somebody typically has donuts. I eat a donut. We go back up to our list. We look how much is a donut, or we, you know, if you can get nutrition information on it, if you have donuts from the store or something, or a muffin, you know. Oh, I don't eat that. I eat, you know, ate a little bit of fruit. I'm pretty healthy. Okay. I eat another carb in fruit at my morning snack. And just go through your whole day like that. At lunch, do you eat a sandwich? Do you go and get Chinese? Do you have rice? You know those big tubs of rice. Most of those will have a good 3-4 cups of rice, and, you know, people can eat it all. If you eat 3 cups of rice, remember I said a 1/3 cup rice is 1 serving, that would be 9 carbohydrate servings. And then if they get to dinner and they go, oh, okay, I usually have a potato or a sweet potato or something, even though a sweet potato is healthy, it's a high glycemic load food. So total it all up, how many do you take in a typical day? And I would say on average, it's really, really common to get in a good 10, 12, 14 servings a day. But this brings the awareness, and it's a great tool to use. And what I like to do is keep copies of it sitting out in our lobby, so when people are sitting there waiting, they can pick it up and look at it and go through the exercise. So it's available as a tool that we offer. It's on our lifestyle guidance portal. For those of you that are already Metabolic Code subscribers, it's under the Diet Resources tab. It comes in really handy when you have your clients that have their weight around the waist, especially in the belly, you know, and they are overweight and they have all these insulin resistance, you know, issues with elevating blood glucose, high blood pressure, or elevating blood pressure, elevating blood sugar. and they need to get it under control. You really need to have a good talk with them about understanding that where that typically comes from is over intake of the wrong kind of carbs, and you need to get it under control. Another way that you can get the metabolic code carb counting tool is to go to the JimLaValle.com site, and there's a link for it there that you can just enter in your email and it will get emailed to you. So we've made this tool available because my husband Jim LaValle has been doing a lot of media, and we're trying to raise awareness of this issue, and so we offer it to people that see him as a way to get them introduced to the concept of controlling the carbohydrate intake. Now, moving on to the next slides, and I know we're getting close on time. I just included this slide to show you the metabolic code diet. We come in at around 25% of the calories from carbs, so we're definitely solidly in this low-carb category, and kind of where that compares with other low-carb diet approaches. Let's move on, though. The other factors that are in our diet are the fact that, use of antibiotics and other things that wipe out gut flora, and this whole gut health and gut dysbiosis factor is a huge occurrence today, because most people now are, when you're growing up, you get sick, you're given antibiotics, or maybe people are chronically given antibiotics for acne or something, and this whole issue of immune reactivity to foods crops up. And so for an awful lot of people, you can move on to the next slide, as a part of their health picture, they have this yeast dysbiosis, and they get gas and bloating. They maybe already have signs and symptoms of, allergic responses in the body. Things like, seasonal allergies mean that probably there's been some dysbiosis that's gone on because their immune system wasn't trained correctly from not having enough beneficial flora. And I don't want to go into this in depth. I simply want to say, you can move on to the next slide, that another key factor in diet is that there are allergenic proteins in foods. Therefore, foods can cause an immune response. And another important part of diet and restoring health for people, it might need to include an exploration of whether they're having an immune response to highly allergenic foods like wheat and dairy and maybe eggs or soy. And it should be part of their health picture. And for so many people that are seeking out, help from integrative medicine, they will have this whole, what I call, milieu of problems. And so what we've done is we've put together the metabolic code diet that incorporates not only controlling the carbohydrate intake, but is has eliminated the highly allergenic foods, wheat and cow's milk, dairy, and therefore and some other allergens, and therefore it allows people to eat low carb, low allergen, get the inflammation down in the body, and start to figure out their response to high glycemic load foods and their response to highly allergenic foods, and put it all together at the end into a diet that works for them. So that's the whole of what's built into the metabolic code diet. But let's move on here. Oh, and as another, kind of a side thing, okay, we also encourage people to eat organic and or sustainably raised foods for a reason, because this toxic burden can be a thing that affects people over time and can contribute to insulin resistance and can contribute to suboptimal thyroid activity in the body. And so over time, if you're able to also make this change in your diet, you can help reduce insulin resistance, help improve thyroid activity, and have another impact on our beneficial impact on our health in this way. So this is all the things that are built into the metabolic code diet. Okay, just moving on. So go ahead and keep going. That's just to prove the points of, there are pesticides in foods and they can affect us. So what all is built into metabolic code? As I said, modified low carb, higher protein, healthy fats. We take out the food allergen, and we emphasize organic foods. And then to round it out, we go, okay, we've assessed your metabolic health and your function and where you may have disruptions in metabolism, and we support it with supplements. And that's the whole of the metabolic code diet and metabolic code health programs. That's what we train people to do, because even, you know, big consortiums on obesity are now saying we've got to think outside the box and we've got to address things like sleep. So on the diet itself, you'll see that you're eating a lot of low-carb, non-starchy vegetables. You're eating maybe a little more protein than you normally did, and you're eating high-quality, you know, sources of fat. Okay, we're limiting the starchy foods, and we walk people through how to do that in the diet materials and fruits. Okay, that's how the diet works. So that's putting all of that into one diet. Now, what is the reason? Go ahead and move on. What is the reason for all of, you know, one of the other things that all of these factors do is they help control, they help improve satiety and control hunger. So that's a big benefit of eating this way. Over time, the hunger comes down, people can stick to it. Okay, moving on. However, there's the big however, and this is why I wanted to concentrate on carb counting tonight. You know, that's a big bite of a diet there, to kind of put it with a little bit of a metaphor. It's a lot. However, we try to lay it out and make it as easy as possible. Every now and then I have clients come in that are pretty overwhelmed by it. And so what I choose to do, rather than not do anything, is say, okay, well, how about if we just concentrate on your carbohydrate intake this time? And we'll get that portion of diet so that you're understanding it, and we'll get that under control. And then later on, we can move on to the whole diet, so to speak. And I especially do this if insulin resistance is a primary health issue for the person. If they come in and they have all this, you know, tendency toward the gut dysbiosis problems and a tendency towards autoimmunity, then I strongly recommend that they take on the food allergen component of the diet as well, because that's where they're going to get the biggest bang for their buck on improving their symptoms. But when it's, you know, a lot of insulin resistance, or if weight loss is a primary goal or need, and the person is just too overwhelmed by the diet as a whole, I'll just start out with carbohydrate counting. And I like it as an easy way to introduce healthier ways of eating. Sometimes when people are just new to your practice, maybe they're not as into, you know, integrative medicine type approaches as a whole, just to make it simple, but something of very big value for them, for their health. So that's how you do carbohydrate counting, and that's why. And sometimes if I just want to do that when people are overwhelmed with the whole the diet as a whole. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I will gladly take questions. But as you can see here, you know, the metabolic code diet, in summary, is a very comprehensive diet. There's a lot built into it. It's very effective in taking down both primary sources of inflammation that occur in people between carb load and allergen load. But it is a great education for people if they're too overwhelmed, or you just decide, hey, this is the most important thing for this person. Let's just get them educated on knowing how to count their carbs, figure out what their intake is, and cut it down from there. So on our carbohydrate counting tool, what we recommend is cutting the carbohydrate level at least in half, or if they want to do another way, what they can do is they can cut out all those high glycemic load foods, for starchy foods, for a couple of days, and then see what happens and start to add servings in one at a time, and get to a level that they feel is enough to keep them satiated, but not so much that they're not continuing to lose weight. Or another way you can monitor how much carbohydrate you need is to go by blood glucose. So if people are up for it, they can get a blood glucose monitor. They can look at their blood glucose levels after they eat, and they can say this, 2 starch servings at a meal is an amount that my blood sugar doesn't spike too high for too long. And this, while that's a little more involved there, that's really one of the primary things you're after, is that postprandial glucose control. So anyway, the tool is available in our lifestyle guidance portal. And are there any questions?
Yes, our first question is, when you say you should eat protein with your carbs, does that include things like protein powder or just meats?
If it's like say a morning meal especially, that seems to be where it's easier to use protein powders. But it could be with another meal, but in general what they were referring to in the study was actual animal protein. They were referring to having chicken, turkey, fish, because they emphasize to try to make them lean proteins. But they were talking about animal protein in the study.
Next, how long do clients stay on phase 1, and how restrictive are the carbs for each phase?
How restrictive are the carbs for what? For each phase?
Yes.
Okay. The phase 1, again, is where we just have the 1 or 2 servings of bean or legume per day. And another thing I want to mention here, you have to make sure people measure, because I've had times where the clients are like, oh great, I love beans, and later on down the road they weren't losing weight, and here I came to find out they weren't measuring their servings. So it's important to, people can, even eating too many beans and legumes, I've seen that keep people from losing weight. But phase 1 is done for a variable amount of time, for a reason. Because people come into the diet with all different sorts of scenarios and all different amounts of weight to lose. And they will respond differently to the diet. So phase 1, we recommend it is a minimum of 2 weeks, but it can be, depending on their response, they can stay in phase 1 for, it's a nutritionally balanced intake. So they can stay on phase 1 for a few months if they want. When would you do that? Well, say someone has 100 pounds to lose, and they get on that phase 1 and they eat that way, and they feel good on the diet. Sometimes when people cut down the carbohydrate like this, they think they'll feel like lower energy, or they'll feel a little, although not typically on our diet, because we've got enough other food in there that they're not dragged down. But a lot of times people with insulin resistance, when they cut down that high glycemic load part of the diet, their energy comes up, because all of a sudden the insulin receptors start to work again, and they're getting better blood delivery of glucose into into the cells and into the mitochondria, and they start pumping out and making energy again. See, what happens with insulin resistance is people, they get dragged down because they're not getting delivery of those nutrients into the cells. So when we start to reverse and get insulin resistance under control and insulin sensitivity restored, energy a lot of times will improve. Now, sometimes I'll have people come off of phase 1 a little bit sooner if they tell me they lost an extreme amount of weight, so they had really rapid weight loss, and they're really, really hungry still. So what I will have them do is go ahead and come out of phase 1 by adding a little bit of starchy foods back into the diet, maybe 1 or 2 servings at lunch and two servings at dinner or something. Or if it's a real big man, maybe we'll have them do 3 servings of starch in the evening, something like that. But it gets that hunger under control, and they'll still lose weight on this level, some people. That's where that variable response to the high glycemic load food comes in. So, and then typically what I try to do is have them stay on phase 2 with maybe an added in amount of starch, but gluten-free starchy foods, until they get closer to their goal weight, and wait until later to do the food allergen reintroduction. I like it if people don't do food allergen reintroduction anything before 3 or 4 months. That would be a minimum to do phase 1 and or phase 2. And then wait and do that food allergen reintroduction way later. And in fact, if it's somebody with, you know, with the autoimmune tendencies and the gut dysbiosis issues, I try to get them to wait at least 6 months, because my goodness, they, you know, they just got their symptoms under control. You know, their joint pain is going away. Why would they want to upset the apple cart, so to speak, by, you know, doing an early reintroduction? Now, realistically, what you'll see tends to happen is that some people will, you know, heck, before you know it, 6 weeks have barely gone by and they ended up eating something that had wheat. Well, that's okay. We don't need to panic. We just need to say, okay, well, how did you feel when you ate that wheat? Did you get pain? Did you get a headache? Did your nose run? Did your sinuses flare up? Did your eczema flare up? How did you feel? That's what we're trying to find out. Was your body having an immune response to that food allergen, you know, in wheat? So, you know, the diet is malleable that way, and sometimes it's bad in that people want, they want things a little more cut and dry, but it's good because then it allows us to respond to individual needs.
Thank you so much. It looks like that will wrap it up for questions for this evening. Please do remember there is the free 30-day trial of the Metabolic Code System platforms, including the Lifestyle Guidance Portal, which houses the featured Metabolic Code diet. You can get full.
And I want to talk a little bit about my next webinar. There are a couple of diets that are coming real heavy on the scene and becoming more highly recommended diets by different groups of people. One is a low-fat plant-based diet. So we know that in conventional medicine there's been this big trend to start recommending plant-based diets, and I'd like to review what those diets are and what the impact of them is on health. On the other extreme, we have very, very high-fat ketogenic diets becoming very popular, and I would like to discuss the impact of those diets, and in particular focus on the effects on the microbiome with that diet. So that'll be our topic next time.
Okay, great. Thanks, Laura, and everyone who attended. Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.